Hello everyone, my name is Rick van Bruggen from Neotechnology, and here we are again recording another Neo4j Graph Database podcast. Tonight I'm joined by Chris Daly, all the way from Oregon. Hi Chris.
Hello.
Hey, good to have you on the podcast. Thanks for
Thanks.
making the
Yeah,
time.
thanks for having me.
Yeah, super. Chris, I read some of the blog posts that you wrote for us around Neo4j and the Internet of Things. That's probably the most hyped term I've heard in the past decade. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you do and how you got involved with Neo4j and the Internet of Things.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Chris Daly. I've been a software engineer for about 20 years now. I'm not using Neo4j or doing Internet of Things for my day job, but for the last several years, I've been both using Neo4j for Internet of Things at home for um, hardware hacking hobby projects that I work on. I wanted to mention that. So I noticed in your podcast you asked people where they first encountered Neo4j.
Yep.
It was actually on another podcast that I first heard about Neo4j. There's a podcast I listen to sometimes called Hansel Minutes.
Okay.
It's Hansel Minutes.
Yeah.
The podcaster is named Scott Hanselman. He lives somewhere in the Portland area, kind of where I live.
Hmm.
And this was episode 280 of Hansel Minutes. He talked about graph databases. This was back in August of 2011. So it was a general podcast about graph databases. That was, I think, my first introduction
Oh,
to
I
the
have to look
idea.
that up.
He talked about Neo4j, but he was interviewing someone from Microsoft Research who was talking about his database at Microsoft, but it was also more general. They covered Neo4j too. And so at the time, I was kind of walking around my neighborhood listening to this podcast thinking, this sounds really cool. I want to try one of these graph databases. I didn't at the time need a database for anything, but I was also at the time starting to work on the Internet of Things projects. When I first started that stuff, I don't think I'd heard the term Internet of Things. I thought of it as hardware hacking. I was finding things like Arduino type
Yeah.
computers and starting to play around with those. Um, and at the beginning, it was just me figuring out how to do simple things, turn lights on and off or read a sensor. But it reached a point where I had several of these little computers with several sensors, and they're all, ready to post data. And suddenly I needed a database or wanted a database to record that data and graph it and do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so that was the point at which I came back to Neo4j and started playing around with it. I could have used a SQL database.
Sure.
The data I have is mostly time series data, and I think it would work well with SQL. But I was still interested in learning about graph databases, so I picked up Neo4j and I started running it on an x86 host machine, and I had my little internet things around the house posting their data, and got that working, and that was kind of fun. But then I thought, this would be way cooler if I can run Neo4j on some of these little things.
Yay.
And I first tried it with the original Raspberry Pi.
Yeah.
That did not work. The first Raspberry Pi is ARM6 architecture, and this was also in the Neo4j 1.x timeframe.
Hmm.
And there was something about ARM6 where Neo4j wouldn't support it. But there are similar machines like the BeagleBone Black, which are ARM7. And so I got Neo4j to run on the BeagleBone Black, and then subsequently on similar ARM7 machines like a PCDuino is another one. And once I had that working, it was just a lot of fun. I mean, I ran into problems. I could run Neo4j on the BeagleBone Black for maybe a week or so, and then it would mysteriously crash. And so I spent a lot of time like figuring out those things and getting it to run smoothly for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And that's really why, like, I considered dropping Neo4j for a while, but I've always been able to get it to do what I needed it to do. And I was able to get it running smoothly on the BeagleBone Black for weeks at a time.
Yeah.
And really happy about that.
So
One,
tell me a little bit about the specs of those machines. How big are those machines? Like RAM and OS that they run. I have no
yeah, so
idea.
both the Raspberry Pi and the BeagleBone Black have a half a gig of RAM, and they're single core. And I'm referring to the original Raspberry Pi here. So single core ARM7 or ARM6, half a gig of RAM. Now there's a Raspberry Pi Model 2
Yeah.
which is ARM7, and that one is quad core and it's got a full gig of RAM, so it's like so much better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Neo4j runs happily on the new Raspberry Pi, this Raspberry Pi Model 2,
Hmm.
and it's also I'm running it now on Raspberry Pi Model 2s, and there's a company called Odroid that makes machines that are pretty similar to the Raspberry Pi Model 2, a little bit higher performance. So I'm running it on those two. They're both, again, ARM7. Some of the Odroids have 2 gigs of RAM, so they've
Okay.
got even more. One thing I wanted to point out while we're talking here is, so I have a lot of information about what I've been doing on my GitHub pages, and I put up a couple of pictures for us to look at and talk about that will kind of explain, I think, some of what I'm doing here.
Yep.
So my GitHub user ID is CJ Daly, CJDALY. So if you go to github.com/CJDALY/fold,
Actually, Chris,
FOLD.
Chris,
Mm-hmm.
what I'll do is, when I post the podcast, I'll also, include it in a transcription on on my blog. So
Sure.
I'll put some links in there, and then people can find that the easy way.
Okay. Yeah.
So can I ask you a question? So what I'm hearing is that so you're using Neo4j on these tiny little machines, and they're receiving all of this wonderful information, weather information, whatever it is, sensor information, and you're storing that into Neo4j. How do you find the match for these types of applications and the particularities of a graph database? Is it a good fit, you think?
I think well, again, like I said, I've started a lot of time series data, and that would be a good fit for SQL, but it's working fine in Neo4j. What I'm using Neo4j for so far is not really that complicated, or I don't think I'm stressing it to its limits. I'm using it. I have a time tree, which I talked about in the blog
I
post.
saw that. Yep.
And so as I go along, as I capture new sensor data, I'll add another minute to the time tree if it's new for that minute, and then I'll connect the sensor data node to the minute node, and so then later I can write queries that will, like one thing I could do is say, give me the data kind of for every hour, so I can get long graphs that show over the course of weeks by looking at data from every hour or every half hour, that kind of thing.
You can easily select a subgraph, basically, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But I am still very much working my way up the Cypher learning curve. I mean,
Okay.
I've managed to do a few cool things, but when I look at the Slack channels, the Help Cypher Slack channel, I see people doing really cool things that I don't fully understand yet. So I'm still learning and trying to get better at Cypher.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, have you got any fancy plans for the future here that you want to use this technology for, or what are any hobby projects once your kitchen gets remodeled?
Well, so again, if your users make it to my GitHub pages, I have some pictures on that fold repository of these little internet things that I've built, and this is what I love to do the most, and what I'll probably be doing more of is that I I look around at websites that sell all of these little parts like SparkFun or Adafruit or ones that people may have heard of, and I just try to find cool little parts that I can assemble into working computer systems and then write the custom code for. So on this one fold GitHub repo, I have pictures of 2 of the systems that I've recently built. One is based on the Raspberry Pi 2, and the other is one of these Odroid systems. They're both running Neo4j, and they both have weather data sensors, so they're capturing humidity and temperature and barometer information, and then storing that in Neo4j. And so that, I mean, one thing I'd like to do, I think, is go farther, make even more interesting. These are both, what I've done with both of these systems is built wall hanging computers. So they're framed in like a picture frame, and they hang on the wall, and there's a power cord that drops down to wherever the plug is. And in these cases, actually, they're both power over Ethernet. So there's a single cord coming down that will give power and Ethernet to the machine. So I'm interested in doing more projects like that with whatever cool hardware parts I can find. But in terms of Neo4j and Cypher, I'm also, like I said, I'm pretty far down the learning curve. I'm interested in learning more and doing more interesting things with Neo4j on these little devices.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, there's I don't know if you're into that at all, but some of these Raspberry Pi and Arduino groups, the most active groups that I've seen here in Europe are actually the groups that have kids learn to program these things. Is that popular at all in Oregon, or like coder dojos or those types of things? Is that anything that
Um,
happens
I
there?
think it is. I have two kids who are a little bit too young for this, but
Okay.
I'm hoping to get them into it later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think that in high schools around here, they're used for teaching.
Yeah, it's super cool, right? I mean, it's so tangible and so low barrier to access. It's cheap as well. It's a nice way for kids to learn how a computer works, I think. Cool,
Definitely.
Chris. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We like to keep these short and snappy, so I really appreciate your time. And first of all, good luck with the remodeling at home and with the projects that you have lined up. And I hope to see you someday at Graph Connect or another conference, maybe.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay, bye bye.